It is an uncontested fact that the flesh-eater courts are the most fascinating faction in the Age of Sigmar. But what is their history? Where do they come from? Tonight on Flesh-Eater Courts University. Welcome to FECstory 101, where we will be covering the history of the Flesh-Eater Courts faction in the real world throughout both Warhammer Fantasy and the Age of Sigmar. We'll start our timeline in 1983 with the founding of Warhammer through Games Workshop. Warhammer in this day and age was a little different than the current game and manifestation. It was a lot more of a role-playing tabletop war game RPG, much more akin to Path to Glory in the current books. Players in the original Warhammer could select their army and meet upon the battlefield, building out their own characters, building out their own units to have different magical abilities, characteristics, or units from various supplements. In 1994, the first ghoul models appeared, an option to be taken by an undead army. Here you can see, cast in the original pewter metal mixture, that these had the vestigial beginnings of a ghoul model. And although not officially related to Flesh-Eater Courts or the predecessor bloodline, this was the first model that would become what would become the Flesh-Eater Courts. Shortly after that, in 1999, Games Workshop produced new ghoul miniatures, again metal, with their detail being a bit raised from the last edition, and a little more weaponry, a little more sinister behavior added in. In 2001, we have our first reference to the Strigoi, and the first Strigoi models. In Warhammer Fantasy, you had the vampire counts, which were broken down into various bloodlines, of them being the Von Karsteins, your traditional Brad Pittish, I want to drink your blood aristocracy of vampires. You had the Lamians, a little more of a Egyptian lean, sexy, seductive vampires. You had your Necrarchs, your nerdy, locked in a tower or down in a crypt, bookish vampires. Your Blood Dragons, your martial prowess, honorable warfare vampires. And finally, the Strigoi. The Strigoi line, throughout Warhammer Fantasy and into Age of Sigmar, would become the Flesh-Eater Courts far into the future. Another amazing point for Flesh-Eater Courts history is that in 2001 is the first mention of Usharan. Mentioned first in White Dwarf, issue 257. Usharan was stated to be the king of the Strigoi vampires and the progenitor of the Strigoi line. In 2008, the metal Vargulf model was introduced. This would later become the Vargulf Courtier. A Vargulf in Warhammer Fantasy was a vampire who had given in to the hunger. This hunger, this all-consuming drive to feed upon blood, is what makes a vampire, or one of the many factors that makes a vampire in Warhammer Fantasy. Should you give in fully to this need, this drive, you would mutate to a more bestial form. You would see this in partiality with the Strigoi, much more embracing their bestial nature than their aristocratic brethren. The Vargulf was produced in metal originally, but being around 2008, right at the time of the housing crash and the Obama-era policies putting new taxes and regulations on metal imports, many miniatures manufacturers began to switch to different experimental types of resin. For Games Workshop, this was Finecast, and it was anything but fine. Also in 2008, Games Workshop released plastic ghoul models. And yes, those are the same ghoul models we are using today. In 2008, Breaking Bad premiered. In 2008, Low by Florida was the most popular song in America. In 2008, The movie Step Brothers came to theaters. 2008, therefore, was the first year in which miniatures that would one day be called Flesh Eater Courts were produced. In 2011, Warhammer Fantasy created one of the greatest models to grace the tabletop scene, the Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon, or Vampire Lord on Terrorgeist. This was created for the Vampire Counts of Warhammer Fantasy, and would later become, and still is, the centerpiece model for the Flesh Eater Courts. At this time, it was the second appearance of a Strigoi-like model, other than the Vargulf, who was not considered to be strictly Strigoi, but could be of any vampiric bloodline that just gave into the hunger. In 2014, the end times began, and it was an exciting time for Warhammer Fantasy players. Things were moving forward, the narrative was being pushed in a way it had never been pushed before, and the Nagash model released. This model, alongside the Nagash End Times books, gave Death players a new breath of life, as it were. But the End Times would end with the destruction of the old world. They would end with the laughing of chaos gods. And then there was nothing. There was silence. There was panic amongst the Warhammer world. What would come next? What would replace Warhammer Fantasy? And so we waited. In 2015, the Age of Sigmar began, and with it came a new rule set, all 4 pages. Not quite the core rulebooks of today, a 4-page PDF that you could download for free and play with your friends. Points values no longer mattered. Take whatever models you like. Factions and which armies could go together? Figure it out yourself. Who knows? It all came down to your imagination and what you and your opponent wanted to play, and therefore, it was utter chaos. Special rules included, if you were playing against a dwarf player and they had a longer beard than you, they got to go first. In the 2015 release of Age of Sigmar was a PDF for the Vampire Counts. Within them were rules for the models that would become the Flesh Eater Courts. A selection of 7 war scrolls split across 5 kits, and the first mention of the Black Hunger. There was the Ghoul King on foot, the Ghoul King on Zombie Dragon, the Ghoul King on Terrorgeist, all from the same kit, Nagash, of course, as well as the Crypt Ghouls, the Crypt Horrors, and of course, that metal, now Finecast, Vargulf. In 2016, the first official Flesh Eater Courts army book came out, making them a standalone faction for the first time all the way back from those original Ghoul models in 1994. In this new Flesh Eater Courts tome, we have the first reference to Feeding Frenzy, which in the next edition would become the backbone of the army. The new Flesh Eater Courts army had 12 war scrolls available, all coming from only 4 kits. Nagash was no longer specifically part of the faction, but you did have the Abhorrent Ghoul King on foot, Abhorrent Ghoul King on Zombie Dragon, Abhorrent Ghoul King on Terrorgeist, Vargulf Courtier, Crypt Ghoul Courtier, the Ghoul Courtier, Crypt Ghouls, Crypt Horrors, Crypt Haunter Courtier, Crypt Flayers, and Crypt Infernal Courtier. Again, all 12 of these war scrolls coming from only 4 kits. An amazing yet humble start to the greatest faction in Age of Sigmar. In 2019, the 2nd edition Flesh Eater Courts book came out, and with it, a stockpile of new rules, if a more limited release on models. The new models that came out in this generation were the abhorrent Arc Regent, a solo foot character in a multi-part plastic kit showing the new detail that could be added into the line. It also came with the Endless Spells, the Corpsemare Stampede, the Cadaverous Barricade, and the Chalice of Boucheron. Finally, they added the Charnel Throne, a terrain piece for the Flesh Eater Courts. This 2019 release saw the Flesh Eater Courts buffed up to 17 War Scrolls across 7 kits, although the roster was not particularly expanded in this time. During 2nd edition, Flesh Eater Courts saw one of the most powerful rules ever added to the game in Feeding Frenzy, the ability to activate any unit you wanted twice in a combat phase with a pile-in on each fight. Then came the long wait. In spring of 2022, the Grimwatch were released for Warhammer Underworlds. This diverse cast of Flesh Eater Courts miniatures was eventually given a war scroll that could be taken by the army. First as 2 separate parts, the hero and the unit, and then later as the unit altogether. In December of 2022, a strange thing occurred. The Arc Regent with Crown of Delusion model was released and available for order for a very short window. A lot of speculation has gone out, wondering what game this was actually made for, perhaps as an expansion to Cursed City. It was available to order in December 2022 and January 2023 before disappearing from the web store forever. In summer of 2023, the Royal Beast Flayers were added as a warband for Warcry, another smaller skirmish version of Age of Sigmar. This, once again, showed the potential detail in miniatures for the Flesh Eater Courts, and is still seen as one of the best sculpts in the range today. Shortly after the release of the Royal Beast Flayers, the Marrow Scroll Herald came out, announcing the potential for a further wave of Flesh Eater Courts. With the addition of the Marrow Scroll Herald, it brought the Flesh Eater Courts to 20 War Scrolls across 10 kits. But the wait continued. For 1,833 days, Flesh Eater Courts players waited for their new battle tome to arrive. The longest of any extant Age of Sigmar army to date. This wait lasted a duration nearly the entirety of 3rd edition of Age of Sigmar. In February of 2024, the newest wave of Flesh Eater Courts arrived, and with it, a host of new miniatures, beautiful sculpts, and brand new rules, including the Noble Deed points. The new Flesh Eater Courts Battle Tome added not only Boucheron, Mortarch of Delusion in all of his Elden Ring glory, and his intimidating size and presence, the like of which no one had guessed at, but also the Abhorrent Cardinal, the first priest for the Death Grand Alliance. Also to be added were the Morbeg Knights, the first cavalry entry to the Flesh Eater Courts. The Decapitator model was brought in, allowing for a new type of courtier, with the old Ghoul courtier being retired, allowing you to use all of the models in the Ghoul kit from 2008, remember, to build ghouls instead of having 19 ghouls in a box and 1 foot hero. Grand Justice Gormane was added in, along with incredible lore, fluff, and a brilliant sculpt, really showing how far the parody and mockery of society could be taken in miniatures. The Abhorrent Gore Warden, one of the most beautiful models in the range, with one of the most dynamic poses, was added in 2024 as well, really rounding out your options for abhorrence in your army. Also in 2024, a new Vargulf model was released for the Vargulf Courtier, this one replacing the 2008 Finecast sculpt, bringing the line fully into modern plastic. With the addition and rise of Boucheron Mortarch of Delusion, that brought the Flesh Eater Courts up to 27 War Scrolls and 17 kits, a 425% increase from the start of the Flesh Eater Courts line. The Grimwatch was dropped alongside the Ghoul Courtier, However, what we gained made it completely worth it. With the addition of so many models and brand new rules, what more could a Flesh Eater Courts player ask for? Except perhaps to have their rules last more than 3 months. Age of Sigmar 4th edition came out in summer of 2024, and after it, a strange blip. The Skinnerkin were released for Warhammer Underworlds, added as a war scroll, and then quickly removed, never to be seen again, leaving that count of 27 war scrolls across 17 kits. And that brings us to the present date, with Flesh Eater Courts being announced to have a new army book coming out later this year, as well as at least one new model, High Falconer Felgrin. Flesh Eater Courts players have an awful lot to be proud of with this sort of history. The creativity, passion, lore, and support that FEC players have shown have grown this faction from a measly 4 kits pulled out of Warhammer Fantasy's vampire race into the juggernaut of competitive play and modeling that we see today. I don't know about you, but I look forward to seeing what Flesh Eater Courts holds in store for us. Thank you. This has been Flesh Eater Courts University.